Well, Indiana is one of the few states in the country with no statewide rent control laws. Now, some of you asked if Indiana should have rent control laws. Isabella Vesperini has this report for this week's City Limits.
Landlords have the freedom to increase rent by any amount, but are not permitted to raise rent for retaliatory or discriminatory reasons, or during the middle of a lease's term unless specifically allowed by a contract. State Senator Fatty Kadura thinks the lack of laws in place could be due to organizations opposing legislation counter to their financial interests. He also thinks the General Assembly has a limited understanding of the issue.
It has been reported publicly that some legislators are landlords themselves, and they fear that such regulations would impact them personally or their own communities.
Kadura says the lack of rent control laws affects limited income families the most. And since the state has few rent control laws, there's a lack of enforcement and penalties. Tenants may not be able to break a lease if things are not working out because other affordable units may not be available or they can't afford to quit their job and find another one. In fact, rent and demand for housing have increased since the pandemic.
There are other factors that are driving the monthly rent or rental prices in Indiana, including out-of-state investors who are buying homes and properties in Indiana. So they are creating a short supply of affordable homes in our state.
Others don't think rent control laws are necessary.
Imagine whatever product you're trying to sell, and now instead of having a free market, someone stepping in and saying, well, we're only going to allow you to sell this product for this certain amount.
McCoy thinks rent control laws would push things in a negative direction and make it difficult for his employees to afford the cost of living.
That's very difficult because on the other side of the ledger, you have to pay employees, you have to pay for upkeep, you have to give raises, you have to do all the things you have to do to operate a business.
McCoy says he is less likely to raise rent as much if someone is renewing their lease. If someone is renting with Grant Properties for the first time, he increases rent with inflation. Rents have been increasing at around 3 to 4% annually in the last years, he said. McCoy also cited zoning constraints. In a crowded college town like Bloomington, it is harder to develop and subdivide land.
Go up around Indianapolis, go to Carmel, Fishers, Noblesville, Zionsville, Westfield. I mean, just unbelievable growth. And usually always compared to Bloomington, lower housing prices because it's much more friendly to new development.
Kadura proposed Senate Bill 202 last year, but it didn't pass. The bill would have created an escrow model. If landlords did not address any living condition issues, such as structural damage or growing mold, within 30 days, then the tenant could go to a local court and pay rent to a third party. The bill also specifically defined safe living conditions and would have required that out-of-state investors maintain headquarters in Indiana for at least 5 years. Kadura says he will be reintroducing Senate Bill 202 this legislative session, but as a second author instead. Republican Senator Greg Walker will be the primary author.
Sometimes being part of the minority, it's more of an uphill battle to even get a hearing on some of these bills.
John Zodi is director of the Housing and Neighborhood Development Department at the City of Bloomington. He says there are 29,000 rental units within city limits. Bloomington is among one of the top 5 most expensive rental markets in the state. Depending on the area, average rent is between $1,200 and $1,600 a month. Zodi said the city tries to influence the rental market to add more affordable housing units through the Unified Development Ordinance.
Just because you have all these new apartments going up doesn't mean that everyone has a place that they can afford to live, right? So there's always a challenge to look at the people, what are the gaps, right? And who's missing out on that affordability.
The city can also work with developers to make the apartments more affordable in exchange for potentially lowering land cost. The city may subsidize the cost of land with public tax dollars. For Indiana News Desk, I'm Isabella Vesperini.